Hello and welcome to Dunning-Kruger Philosophy, home of oversimplified summaries of complex ideas. For today's episode, we are going to examine one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s most divisive and controversial speeches, Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break the Silence. This speech turned much of the mainstream media against him. The New York Times published an article titled King's Error. The Washington Post stated in an op-ed that King's speech had diminished his usefulness to his cause, to his country, and to his people. Even the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, critiqued him, accusing him of linking two disparate issues. But after listening to and reading his speech in the present day, I cannot help but see it as prescient, as an ignored warning. It also showed me a side of MLK that was in some ways far more radical than the general public's perception of him. But first things first, I think a little background is in order. Whilst I imagine most viewers will have at least a vague idea of who MLK was and what he stood for, hell, it's likely that some of you may know more than me. I still think it's for the best if I provide a brief introduction to his life and works, in particular his relation to both the civil rights movement and nonviolent resistance. Though I won't bother going into exacting detail on what exactly nonviolent resistance is. The name is fairly self-explanatory, at least on a surface level, and it will suffice for today's purposes. But if you wish to learn more, I suggest you check out an introduction to nonviolent resistance, in which I briefly cover the topic and some of its potential limitations. So who was Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.? Well, as you might have guessed from that title, he was a Baptist minister. Which I mentioned first, thanks to MLK grounding much of his non-violent beliefs and actions in his understanding of Christianity. He played a pivotal role as a spokesperson and organiser for the US civil rights movement, a campaign and movement to end racial segregation, discrimination, and disenfranchisement throughout the United States through the use of non-violent resistance. MLK was directly involved in organising the Montgomery bus boycott, the non-violent protests in Birmingham, Alabama, and the March on Washington, the last of which was where he delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. A speech that is unfortunately oft quoted out of context by right-wing pundits in the US today. After the introduction of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, some of you might think that MLK's work was done, but far from it. He came to see that the US was burdened with an abundance of structural issues, and that African Americans could never gain true equality whilst these issues persisted. The campaigns he was involved in took on a broader scope, with the intention of tackling a range of social issues, such as the Poor People's Campaign, a planned non-violent campaign of mass civil disobedience to end poverty, or his involvement with Memphis's striking sanitation workers. But most relevant to the context of this video, in 1967, after several years of quiet opposition, MLK decided to speak out publicly against the Vietnam War. He delivered this speech at the behest of clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam, a multi-faith organisation who opposed the war, at Manhattan's Riverside Church. Exactly a year later, Martin Luther King was dead, assassinated by James Earl Ray, at least according to the official story. Despite a life cut short, I think it's fair to say that the world is a better place for having had Martin Luther King in it. I think that's enough of a preamble, and hopefully enough background for those who don't know a great deal about MLK. So, let's dive into the meat of this video and take a closer look at MLK's Beyond Vietnam speech, which you can listen to today on YouTube, delivered in Dr. King's glorious preacher's baritone. I will share a link to that above and below, along with a transcript if anyone prefers to check it out for themselves first. Don't worry if you don't have the time or inclination to do so. I intend to summarise and quote the key points and issues as we go along. Now, I won't be covering every section of the speech and intend to focus primarily on aspects relating to nonviolent resistance and structural violence. Though still, the background will need to be set. MLK begins by thanking his hosts and organisers before quoting them. "A time comes when silence is betrayal. That time has come for us in relation to Vietnam." Despite having stayed silent on the matter for the last few years, in order to avoid isolating himself from Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency, MLK found the silence could not remain, as his conscience left him no other choice. The Vietnam War was something he knew to be wrong, an issue he knew his personal reputation could allow him to help tackle. He understood how intertwined many of the US's social issues were with its growing militarism, and he also saw the need to stand against it, not just for those abroad, but also for those at home, civilian and soldier alike. MLK is also keenly aware of the potential cost of speaking out, stating, "The calling to speak is often a vocation of agony, but we must speak. We must speak with all the humility that is appropriate to limited vision, but we must speak." At this point in his life, MLK was regularly receiving death threats. He had been bombed, he had been stabbed, and was consistently harassed by the FBI. I've actually seen a copy of one rather grim and confusing letter sent by the FBI, in which they appear to demand he commit suicide under the threat of revealing an affair. Despite all this, he continued to speak when he saw injustice. So speak he did. In the next section of the speech, he sets out 7 reasons why he, a preacher, was opposed to the war, that I will now proceed to briefly summarise. Firstly, the war was harming attempts to tackle poverty in the US. The poverty program was, quote, broken and eviscerated, as if it were some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war. Secondly, that the war was sending often poor young men, quote, 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. Thirdly, how could he call for non-violent action at home whilst not condemning the violent action abroad? Fourthly, he fears the effects of the war on the soul of the United States. He hopes for a better future, quoting the famed Harlem poet Langston Hughes. "Oh yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be." Fifthly, having received the Nobel Prize, MLK saw it as his duty, a commission that is, quote, a calling that takes me beyond national allegiances, to speak for peace. Sixthly, as a Christian minister, he sees it as his duty to oppose war for the sake of all humans, quote, for communists and capitalists, for their children and ours, for black, for white, for revolutionary and conservative. Have they forgotten that my ministry is in obedience to the one who loved his enemies so fully that he died for them? And finally, he sees it as the duty of all Christians to speak out for the helpless, the voiceless, the weak and oppressed, even for those we call enemy. Quote, no document from human hands can make these humans any less our brothers. So as you can probably see from these 7 reasons, MLK's opposition to the war was deeply rooted in both his role as a non-violent activist, but also in his Christianity, his faith. After setting out these reasons for speaking, MLK proceeds to explain some of the background and build up to the Vietnam War, and its implications for the Vietnamese people. How, despite quoting the American Declaration of Independence in their struggle for liberation from colonial France, not only did the US not recognise them, but they supported attempts of French recolonization, paying up to 80% of the French war costs by the end of that war. After the French failed, the US proceeded to support a variety of authoritarian dictators in southern Vietnam, whilst also undermining attempts at democratic elections and reunification. In today's day and age, these details are easily accessible online, though they still aren't all that well known. It was even less so back in 1967. To appropriate the language of just war theory for a hot minute, MLK came to the conclusion that the US had no jus ad bellum, or in plainer language, it had no just reason to go to war with Vietnam. Neither was it carried out in a way that had jus in bello, or in other words, it was carried out in an unjust and unlawful way. He makes this clear when he speculates on what the Vietnamese people must think of the US. Quote, what do they think as we test our latest weapons on them, just as the Germans tested out new medicines and new torches in the concentration camps of Europe? Where are the roots of the independent Vietnam we claim to be building? Is it among these voiceless ones? MLK, I think, rightly fears the consequences of such sustained injustice on such a grand scale being normalised as a part of American society. Having corresponded with the Vietnamese Buddhist monk and peace activist Thich Nhat Hanh, also sorry for that awful pronunciation, MLK decided to share a message from the Buddhist leaders of Vietnam. Each day the war goes on, the hatred increases in the hearts of the Vietnamese and the hearts of those of humanitarian instinct. The Americans are forcing even their friends into becoming their enemies. It is curious that the Americans, who calculate so carefully on the possibilities of military victory, do not realize that in the process they are incurring deep psychological and political defeat. The image of America will never again be the image of revolution, freedom and democracy, but the image of violence and militarism. This passage could almost be applicable to the US of the modern day, if you switched out a few names. Having laid out his reasons for opposing the war, MLK sets out a series of demands of the United States government that he believes will help end the war in Vietnam. He asks others to speak out, from ministerial students to discard their exemptions and to seek status as conscientious objectors. The remainder of the speech is where he begins to lay out what I consider to be a series of structural problems and potential solutions. Reading them in the modern day is a strange experience. As I have said previously, it often feels like hearing an ignored warning, almost prophetic in nature. Listen for yourselves. The war in Vietnam is but a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit, and if we ignore this sobering reality, we will find ourselves organising clergy and laymen concerned committees for the next generation. They will be concerned about Guatemala and Peru. They will be concerned about Thailand and Cambodia. They will be concerned about Mozambique and South Africa. We will be marching for these and a dozen other names and attending rallies without end unless there is a significant and profound change in American life and policy. Such thoughts take us beyond Vietnam, but not beyond our calling as sons of the living God. For MLK, militarism must be opposed, as if it is not, then it will grow and propagate. I think it's fairly safe to say that the issue hasn't yet been tackled in the US. Just look at the wars in Iraq, the war on terror, and the ever-increasing military budget, even when adjusted for inflation. I think it's also fairly safe to say how saddened MLK likely would be upon learning that the most vehement American supporters of militarism are often those who most vehemently call themselves Christian. To him, militarism and Christianity are incompatible, as it is his very faith that calls him to oppose needless wars such as Vietnam. You could almost say that he was concerned by the increasing presence of cultural violence in the US. To some of you, that might have sounded like nonsense, so to clarify, cultural violence is, according to Johann Galtung, founder of the field of peace studies, any aspect of a culture that can be used to legitimize violence in its direct or structural form. It is, according to Galtung, what makes direct and structural violence look and feel right to those perpetrating it. To further reinforce the point, MLK quotes an American overseas official who stated that it seems to him our nation was on the wrong side of a world revolution. This is in reference to the US's continued support for imperialism in the face of colonial revolutions of self-determination throughout the 1950s and 60s. So he seeks to remind the US of the words of the late John F. Kennedy, who probably should have heeded his own advice. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. The remainder of the speech shifts focus away from the Vietnam War to look beyond it and warn of the consequences of following along a status quo that had led to such injustice. It is these later sections of the speech that I find most intriguing, most prescient, and most radical. MLK states that we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, where machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. This section seems to be an acknowledgement of the interconnectivity of human action, how interweaved and interrelated the problems of the past and the present are. After all, if you can commit horrors abroad to your fellow human beings, how long before you can commit those horrors at home? But as I keep reminding you all, MLK was a Christian. It was a huge part of his identity and values. So, being a pious Christian, he draws upon a biblical parable for the next part of the segment. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will be only an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho Road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. This call for structural change is presented via the lens of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Taking the Jericho Road was known to be risky, full of bandits and danger. MLK thought the best way to help wasn't to give coins to those injured by the road, but to change and improve the road itself. Which is true of many things in the world today. Let's take, for example, crime. If crime is an issue, the best way to tackle it is to go after the source of the problem, what leads to the crime, not just lock away the offenders. A few years ago in Glasgow, Scotland, violent youth street crime was a major problem. But after years of unsuccessful attempts to curtail it, eventually they decided to tackle the root of the issue and introduce a wide variety of social initiatives, including opening a number of youth centres, in the form of the Community Initiative to Reduce Violence programme. Lo and behold, violent youth street crime drops, with the most significant reduction in the number of served clients carrying weapons. On a personal note, I found it really awesome to discover only a few years before Johan Galtung first coined the term structural violence, that MLK was leading non-violent campaigns and giving speeches that seemed to both understand and seek to tackle some forms of it. I have also just realised that I have said structural violence a hell of a lot without defining what I mean. So we will once again use Johan Galtung's terminology, since he has already been brought up. To first define what we mean by violence. For Galtung, violence is present when human beings are being influenced so that their actual somatic, which means relating to their body, and mental realizations are below their potential realizations. Violence is defined as the cause of that difference, what stops humans from flourishing and fulfilling their potential. For example, it would be directly violent to physically stop someone from receiving medical attention for a treatable disease. Structural violence is when this is inflicted by systems and states, not individual actors. And since we are on the topic of structural violence and systemic injustice, it would be remiss of me not to mention some of MLK's failings. As much as I admire the man, he was in many ways a deeply flawed individual, as are we all. In one of his many critiques of nonviolent resistance, Peter Gelderloos mentions the role that King played in suppressing both the participation of women and members of the LGBT community from leadership roles, thus perpetuating structural violence in the forms of patriarchy and homophobia. According to Gelderloos, this aspect of MLK is often avoided by proponents of nonviolent action in their rush to idolise him. So I thought it was best if we address this, as it is far too common for us humans to gloss over the mistakes of past figures only to revel in their triumphs. Despite his vision and wisdom in some areas, he was deeply ignorant in others. Does this mean we should discount all of his works and contributions? Certainly not. But we should definitely keep these mistakes in mind, so we can learn from them and avoid repeating them. But moving on, as some of you might have guessed, you can't talk about implementing social initiatives in the US without being called a communist. Throughout the speech, MLK does address the Cold War tensions that existed at the time. He seeks to make his stance clear on the matter when he states, "Communism will never be defeated by the use of atomic bombs or nuclear weapons. Let us not join those who shout war, and through their misguided passions urged the United States to relinquish its participation in the United Nations. These are days which demand wise restraint and calm reasonableness. We must not engage in negative anti-communism, but rather in a positive thrust for democracy, realizing that our greatest defense against communism is to take offensive action on behalf of justice. We must, with positive action, seek to remove those conditions of poverty, insecurity, and injustice which are fertile soil in which the seed of communism grows and develops. Whilst MLK doesn't seem to agree with Marxism or communism, he was a theist after all. He does seem to understand and agree with many of the needs and desires of those who have turned to it, which is unsurprising considering he had actually read works by Marx and engaged critically with them. It was also almost mandatory at the time for anyone speaking publicly to condemn communism, at least a little bit. After all, he did live in the US, and it wasn't all that long since the McCarthy era's terror. It should also be noted that apparently in private, MLK spoke of his support for both social democracy and democratic socialism. The next section of the speech returns to the issue of war. To me, it seems to be a universalist argument for interreligious unity against it. He argues that every nation must develop an overriding loyalty to mankind. The driving force of this loyalty, unconditional love for all. Quote, "This oft misunderstood, this oft misinterpreted concept, so readily dismissed by the Nietzsches of the world as a weak and cowardly force, has now become an absolute necessity for the survival of man. When I speak of love, I am not speaking of some sentimental and weak response. I am not speaking of that force which is just emotional bosh. I am speaking of that force which all of the great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life. Love is somehow the key that unlocks the door which leads to the ultimate reality. This Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist belief about the ultimate reality is beautifully summed up in the first epistle of St. John. Let us love one another, for love is God, and everyone that loveth is born of God, and knoweth God. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love." The importance of universal love and solidarity with all humanity is really emphasised here. He takes a pluralistic approach to religion, stating that each have tapped into this unifying principle. That to truly love each other is what all faith is meant to be about. As an outsider looking in, I am a non-theist after all, though I haven't quite decided if I'm an atheist or an agnostic. Even one who has read and enjoyed some Nietzsche, I very much appreciate this message, and think he was right in saying that love, compassion and empathy were too readily dismissed by Nietzsche. Though I don't know if it is the cure-all that MLK presents it as here either. He finishes up this speech by bringing it back to the Vietnam War, stating, "We are now faced with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Procrastination is still the thief of time. Life often leaves us standing bare, naked and dejected with a lost opportunity." These words, they resonate deeply in my mind. They were important in their day in regards to the Vietnam War, military build-up, and the risk of nuclear annihilation. And they are important today when faced with the increasingly present climate crisis, increase in geopolitical tensions, and a vast array of compounding issues that have been continuously neglected. And so MLK has one last warning, and offers us one last choice. We still have a choice today. Non-violent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. We must move past indecision to action. We must find new ways to speak for peace in Vietnam and justice throughout the developing world. A world that borders on our doors. If we do not act, we will surely be dragged down the long, dark and shameful corridors of time reserved for those who possess power without compassion, might without morality, and strength without sight. I think these words could also ring true today, don't you? There is still a chance for positive action and change on so many different fronts. especially in this increasingly tense world that seems to be struck by crisis after crisis. There still may be a choice and a chance for a better future. Maybe MLK's non-violent action can show us part of the way. But sadly, it seems to me that the United States didn't listen too closely to his warnings. There are very few people globally who think the US used their power with compassion, morality, or sight. To me, this speech, this impassioned plea for peace in the face of the unjust horror that was the Vietnam War, seems not just a condemnation of war, but of the systems and structural issues that lead to it. MLK is calling for non-violent action against war, but also against these systems, calling for a true revolution of values, that we should shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. I don't think it's a great stretch to say that this speech is almost a call for a form of positive peace, which is defined as an absence of structural violence, a peace that isn't built upon mutual fear of death, but ties of commonality, a fellowship of humans seeking to build a better world. I admire Martin Luther King Jr. greatly. I may not totally agree with everything he says or believes. I may have fundamentally different beliefs about the nature of the universe, God, or how he grounds his belief in non-violent action. But man, do I admire and respect him. As a former Christian who will never believe again, but still has great respect for some of its tenets on compassion and empathy. Though not unflawed, in some ways, MLK seems to represent the best type of Christian. From my understanding, to be a Christian is to strive to be Christ-like in your action, to stand against violence, poverty and oppression, but not add to it, to confront it and yet turn the other cheek when they strike, not if they strike you 77 times. Not to meekly accept the punishment, but to show them that it will not break you, that you will not add more harm into the world. I don't think anyone can deny that MLK truly strove to embody this ideal. You see, as I mentioned earlier, exactly a year after this speech, MLK was assassinated by James Earl Ray, according to the US government, that is. Though MLK's family don't seem to believe them, having publicly stated otherwise. In a probably not so unrelated coincidence, the FBI had been sending MLK threats and demands of suicide. Look it up if you don't believe me. So I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that MLK likely knew that his death was imminent. But he did not despair. In his last speech, MLK states,
"Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land."
He had seen the positive change that non-violent action had helped bring about. He has hope and faith that we will continue to bring about more positive changes. Even when faced with death, he could not help but show a boundless compassion and an unshakable faith in our shared future as humans. This has been Jay from Dunning-Kruger Philosophy, and thank you very much for listening. Feel free to like or subscribe if you enjoyed the video. If I've made any mistakes, or if anyone has any questions, feel free to comment down below. Oh, and one more thing. If any of you are interested in learning more about MLK, the civil rights movement, or Africana philosophy in general, you should definitely check out The History of Africana Philosophy by Chike Jeffers and Peter Adamson. It's a fantastic podcast that is both entertaining and informative. I'll share a link down below if anyone is interested. Thanks again, and I hope everyone has a lovely day.